for Inside Utah Politics with Lindsay Aerts.
Well, thanks for joining us today. I am Lindsay Aerts. Let's go inside Utah politics. House Republicans working to advance a sweeping budget plan that the president has taken to calling the Big Beautiful Bill. It includes some of his biggest priorities, like cutting taxes on tips, overtime, and Social Security, and adding funds for southern border security. But changes to Medicaid and federal food programs are drawing sharp criticism from Democrats and even some Republicans. The House aims to vote on the bill by Memorial Day, but it faces an uncertain path in the Senate. Well, joining me to break it all down is Adam Gardiner. He's a lobbyist with ASG Consulting, and Leah Murray. She is a professor of political science at Weber State University. Thank you both for being here. Okay, very curious about Trump's Big Beautiful Bill and your thoughts on it. $1.5 trillion in spending cuts is what they're hoping for. Some have said that's not enough. Hoping to make the Trump 2017 tax cuts permanent. Adam, your thoughts?
Besides it being a stupid name, I think it's a step in the right direction. I think it's cutting a lot, but over a number of years. I don't think it cuts enough this year. If we're talking about codifying a lot of the proposed cuts from DOGE, I don't think this goes anywhere close to as far as a lot of people would like. The Senate hates the bill. This is what the House can get passed. A couple of the provisions that are struggling to get across the finish line are the SALT, state and local tax write-offs. A lot of the richer delegations in New York and New Jersey and Connecticut, the GOP folks will not vote for this bill unless you raise the SALT deductions, which helps their constituents, but that's unpalatable to other folks across the country, and they can only afford to lose about 3 votes. So it's going to be really touch and go. Extending the 2017 tax cuts, that is good. That is a step in the right direction. That prevents a tax increase for about 62% of American households.
But should we be cutting taxes right now when we are in such a deficit? Leah, maybe I'll have you speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the question is, I don't know that $1.6 trillion in cuts gets anywhere near addressing a almost $37 trillion debt that we have. So I appreciate Republicans always wanting to cut taxes, like I respect that. But the answer is, I think both sides of the ledger have to be in play, right? So I think that the president even asked for an increased tax margin on the wealthiest people in the country, and I think he backed away from it. What you've got is not enough spending cuts, and you have tax cuts, which means neither side of the ledger is actually addressing what I think is the existential crisis, which is a $37 trillion debt.
In 2017, they cut more taxes than they ever had in a long time, but the government raised more revenue than they ever had before. The problem is exactly what Leah was saying. You didn't cut enough spending, and so it led to massive deficits.
Where is our spending coming from? What is the biggest chunk? What is the biggest piece to tackle if it's not this?
3/4 of all federal spending is on entitlement programs. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, Highway Trust Fund. That's where your spending is. They don't spend any time cutting that. They spend all of their time cutting discretionary spending, which is stuff they vote on. Everything else, they never take a vote on it. So it just continues to grow. That's our problem.
Right, and I think the other issue is no one is brave enough to have a real conversation about how to tackle something like Social Security, right? So, or Medicare, which is just rising health costs, and then you put all of our elderly population or older population in the same population pool. How many times can I say population in a sentence? I'm sorry. But all of them in the same pool of people drawing out, no one's putting in. They have to address it. We have to have a real conversation about it.
Okay, so let's talk about it a little bit. This Big Beautiful Bill does include some Medicaid cuts. I think it's 8.6 million people who would lose coverage under it. But there are some reforms that clearly need to be addressed. So what is the right solution here? Are we cutting too much? Are we cutting not enough? What about the people who lose coverage under this?
I think they're going in the right direction. Now, when we think of Medicaid, we're thinking of very poor, underprivileged families, kids. That is not what this bill is cutting. What this bill is cutting is 1.4 million illegals from the rolls of Medicaid. That's not a bad thing. What this is cutting is adult men who can work but are not trying to find work. That's Medicaid expansion, something that Utah did a long time ago, something that I'm kind of against. It's okay to purge these people from the rolls if they're not trying to find jobs, not trying to find work. That's a step in the right direction.
I think Democrats would push back on that, Leah. You can or you can't. I mean, do you think we're going in the right direction?
Well, I think, I got to just tell you, I think health insurance is maybe the biggest bugaboo question. Medicare is health insurance for older people. Medicaid is health insurance for poor people. This is the only country, I think, in the world that ties health insurance to employment, which is problematic, right? So the answer is, of course, Utah wanted to expand Medicaid because we're good people here and we want to make sure children were vaccinated when they needed to be vaccinated. We have to have a serious conversation about health insurance and health care coverage in this country and how we manage that, because that's running off the charts. Right, for two populations, for a poor population, for our elderly population.
Another portion of this bill, no tax on tips, no tax on overtime. I think no tax on Social Security, too, is something that kind of lumps that into that entitlement piece. But does that do enough to help cut some of this spending, or is that just fulfilling a campaign promise of President Trump?
I hate the no tax on tips. I think that is crazy, and I think that that's going to be an unfunded liability. So I'm very against that, but I know it was a campaign promise from the president. And so all of a sudden, Republicans who typically have hated such things are now saying that that's totally fine. So I have to wrap my head around the new GOP of trying to figure out how to make sense of that. But I think that it's going to expand our deficit, and something I'm not a fan of.
Yeah, and I think the interesting thing about the no tax on tips is the unintended consequence to local restaurants as they figure out how do they pay their staff, right? Because they, how do you say, have a model or an equation for how they pay their staff based on the way that we've always taxed those tips, and that's going to be super disruptive in those small business markets, I think.
I think as a lobbyist, I'm going to do my services for free and then just ask for tips at the end.
So you don't have to tax them. Yeah, so maybe every industry goes to a taxing or a tipping industry now. Part of the Big Beautiful Bill also bringing in here locally a little bit is a federal lands sell-off. We've talked about this a lot on this show. We've got a segment coming up talking about it. About 11,000 acres in St. George and Washington and Beaver Counties. The local governments want to use it to be able to maybe do some affordable housing. Obviously, the environmental groups pushing back, saying we can't sell land off in this way. Is it a slippery slope? Is it the right decision?
It's not slippery enough. It needs to be a landslide. Good job, Representative Celeste Malloy. Sell that puppy off. Let's get energy. Let's get housing where it needs to be. Any time that SUWA or other groups are against these types of bills or legislation, I'm all in. Even if I don't know what it does. If SUWA's against it, I'm all in. Grand Canyon Trust is against it, I'm all in.
Seems a little bit disheartening, but
yeah, I mean, I guess the question I have is who are the best stewards of land? And I think Representative Malloy believes it's local governments, and I'm not sure I disagree with that, but I'm not as, how do I say, optimistic or sure that we're always getting it right. And I think maybe a better way of doing this with checks and balances, with people at the table having conversations, right, rather than just pendulum swinging from it's only the Democratic president who gets to decide all the way down to it's only the local governments that are deciding.
I will just say that a lot of these types of groups, when we've been around the table, Senator Romney and John Curtis passed a bill right when Senator Romney was in that affected land on the San Rafael Swell about which roads were open, which ones would be closed. They dealt in good faith with these environmental groups. Everyone said once we get this bill passed, everyone will leave it alone and we're good. A lot of people got what we wanted. Some people didn't get what we wanted, so we'll just leave everything alone. The second the bill passed, these environmental groups started back again closing roads under a Democratic president. Right. And so you're right on this pendulum swinging. The federal government, in my opinion, can't be trusted to handle this. Let the states handle it.
Okay, we shall watch and see how it develops. One final thing, the Ways and Means Committee this week was debating the Trump tax Big Beautiful Bill, and our dear congressman from the 1st Congressional District, Blake Moore, it was an all-nighter. Let's just say that. Let's take a look at what happened during that committee.
Mr. Moore. Mr. Moore.
And the about. Did he play it off well? Some are criticizing him for a lack of leadership. What do you think?
Oh, I couldn't disagree more with that. I think, first of all of us have fallen asleep in a class. I've been a professor in a class.
I fell asleep in her class.
That's right. And you're like, life happens. I feel like that was 5 in the morning that video was taken. Please correct me if I'm wrong.
It was in the afternoon, but they had gone all night.
It was a 17-hour
Probably
meeting.
felt like 5 in the morning, right. They had been in pretty much pulling an all-nighter. Anyone who's ever done a graveyard shift knows these are hard, and those chairs are probably very comfortable.
And he wasn't the only member to fall asleep, and a Democratic representative fell asleep too. I thought it was really funny. I laughed it off, and I thought he played it off really well.
It was very interesting to watch. It did make the rounds on social media for sure. Adam Gardiner with ASG Consulting. We appreciate your time. Leah Gardner, the Walker Institute. Leah Murray, the Walker Institute of Politics up at Weber State. Thank you both for joining me today and all of your insights. We appreciate it. Well, still ahead on Inside Utah Politics, a closer look at that sell-off plan for federal lands, why environmental groups are saying Congress is going too far. Stay with us.
Watching Inside Utah Politics with Lindsay Aerts.
Well, welcome back. We're learning more about Utah Congresswoman Celeste Malloy's proposal to sell off some federal land to help fund the budget. Here's a look at a map of some of the land at issue in southwestern Utah. Her amendment to the budget is looking at about 11,000 acres, a fraction of a percentage of all the federally owned land here in Utah. Now, supporters argue this is a quick way to generate billions in revenue and help growing cities, but critics are concerned about the environmental impacts of selling land for development. Well, I'm joined today by Stephen Bloch. He's the legal director of the Southern Utah Wilderness Alliance. Steve, welcome to Inside Utah Politics.
Thanks for having me, Lindsay.
Yeah, thank you for being here. Okay, so just first and foremost, why are you opposed to this sell-off?
Sure. Well, I think there's a couple important ways to think about this. The first is these are federal lands, right? These are lands owned by all Americans, managed on their behalf by the federal government. They're not to be sold off. They're the lands that people recreate on. They hunt, they fish, they take their families to. This isn't the way to go about trying to deal with, serious issues in southwest Utah. So that's at the highest level. And then at the site-specific level, it's really how Representative Malloy is trying to go about this. Her proposal to sell these roughly 11,000 acres of land came about literally at the 11th hour. It was well after 11 o'clock at night at the end of a 13-hour hearing that the House of Representatives was holding. She unveiled this amendment. Well, she'd been working on the amendment for months ahead of time. Nobody had seen it.
So you take issue with the process of how this came to be?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So there was no input from the public, no review. We can talk about today how you would follow the law that exists to look at the sale of some tracts of land. That's not what's happening here.
Okay, I do want to get to that in just a minute. I want to take a look at some of these maps really quick if we can, or at least one of them, because what Congresswoman Malloy is arguing that some of these parcels of land are very narrow, very, like they're not huge swaths of land. I think the analogy is we're not building housing on Delicate Arch, right? So these are targeted parcels of land, she calls them. Some of them butt up against, the freeway. Some of them are right up against national parks. I mean, the cities have said they want to use these for growth to help the demands down there. To your point, what is the right way to do this if selling these in this way is not it?
Sure. Well, so Congress has passed a variety of laws. There's a lot of tools that exist in the toolbox for the counties to seek certain tracts of land for disposal. And there's actually a slate of lands in Washington County that's already been identified as the starting point for a serious conversation. Those aren't the lands that are at issue here. These are lands that the cities and county just sort of plucked out of thin air. There's no requirement about how they'd be used. So we've heard from Washington City, from St. George, from Washington County that they want to use this for housing. There's no requirement that that happens. They could just as easily flip them for second homes, for resorts, for that sort of activity. It's just not the serious way to go about this. There's a process that involves the public, stakeholders, for very discrete tracts of land. But more generally speaking, again, these are federal public lands, lands that are managed on lands that are managed on behalf of all Americans by these agencies. And you know, the tracts of land that Representative Malloy has proposed here include lands adjacent to Zion National Park, include lands within the Beaver Dam and Red Cliffs national conservation areas. Those are pretty sensitive landscapes. There are some tracts that are by highways. Well, then let's talk about that in a more serious, thoughtful way that involves the public, that allows stakeholders to be involved, know what's on the table.
These parcels that butt up against Zion National Park, they're not in the park, right? So they're not taking land that's federally
Nope.
sectioned off there, right, for our national park, but they do butt up against it. What's your concern there, having locals have control of that land?
Oh, well, I mean, so there's a 300-acre tract that's immediately north of Rockville, right? That small town on the gateway if you're driving into Springdale. That would be for a resort or for some other use that, you know, instead of on the way into the park seeing this magnificent landscape, seeing second homes, seeing a resort, these are, you know, that's not the highest use of these lands to sell them off for development. The lands inside of these national conservation areas, I mean, these are lands that were set aside, important for habitat for species. Congress has spoken that they're to be preserved. Representative Malloy, in this kind of 11th hour gambit, is trying to force their sale. And that's just not appropriate.
But if the cities have said we want to use these for water infrastructure up against the national park, we want to make the entrance better, perhaps. You know, if they are using them for these, again, stated to your point, not in writing purposes, but what they say they want to use them for, is that okay with you, or is it just in general that they've taken these federal lands and they're selling them off?
Well, I think there's a couple pieces. So the first part is, like we've talked about, there are these laws that exist for things like improvements for water infrastructure, for housing, for public purposes. There's a couple of different laws that, of course, the Congresswoman and the counties are well aware of, have not tried to use here, but those are the tools in the toolbox. Instead, what they're trying to do is this sale of federal lands, no sideboards. It's really a trust us kind of approach that the counties, the cities have asked for. And I think the really broader fear from the conservation community is what happens in Utah might not stay in Utah, and that this is really the camel's nose under the tent. If we can sell federal land in Washington County to pay for tax cuts under the president's budget, this could happen anywhere.
I was going to ask, do you see this as a slippery slope to doing this in either in more places in Utah or just across the country?
Oh, I think both. I think both. And I think what Representative Malloy is starting to learn is that you mess with public lands at your own peril. You know, Representative Chaffetz tried something like this about 10 years ago and had to roll it back. The outcry was so loud from hunters, from anglers, from families who like to recreate on these lands, who don't want to see them shut off, who don't want to see them sold off and developed, but who appreciate everything that federal lands bring to them. I mean, that's why we all live in Utah, right? It's because of the access to our federal public lands. These are really our heritage. And the idea that we're going to simply sell them off, and especially the process here of rolling this out at the 11th hour, not giving the public a chance to look at it, not using the tools in the toolbox for how to work with counties to try to address real needs through a more thoughtful, measured approach.
How do you stop this? What's the plan? Are you going to try to stop it? Is there a lawsuit involved?
No, well, so we are trying to stop it. And I think what you're seeing are members of Congress reacting to the potential of sale of federal lands in their state. So, for example, former Interior Secretary, now Representative Ryan Zinke from Montana, who has stated he has a red line in the sand, that he's not going to support this amendment. Representative Hurd, who comes from the West Slope of Colorado, similarly said, this is not what I want to see happening. So, you know, unsurprisingly, Westerners care about their federal public lands, value them really deeply. Poll after poll shows that both Utahns and Westerners really appreciate everything that federal lands bring to them, to their quality of life, and are not interested in seeing them sold off. So we're trying to raise the hue and cry to make sure that people throughout the West and the nation understand what's at stake here.
I want to touch on this one last point before we wrap up. Utah has an enabling clause. Maybe you're familiar with it. When we became a state, basically we had to make some deals with the federal government, and one of those was, quote, the people inhabiting this state do affirm that they forever disclaim all right entitled to unappropriated lands within our boundaries, basically. So they're saying these are Congress's lands, and that's forever the way it shall be. What do they do with this enabling clause in this process?
Yeah, I don't think about the Enabling Act so much at play here, because this would be Congress who has the ultimate authority over federal public lands. If they would pass this into law, they could essentially work around the terms of the Enabling Act. But I'm really happy you brought that up. That's what's really animating, I think, both Representative Malloy, the governor, Washington counties here, is just this animus, this real anger and not acceptance of federal lands in our state. The governor tried to...
They like the lands, they don't want control of the land. They want to be able to manage the lands.
Well, but you know, that's actually not even accurate. So when the governor tried to bring this lawsuit last year, suing the United States, seeking more than 18.5 million acres of federal land, not that it would be handed over to the state of Utah, as he said in the media campaign, but when you read the litigation, the lawsuit, they wanted to force the sale of those lands. That's the end of the equation for them, is force the sale or disposal of millions of acres of federal public land in Utah. The places we all care so deeply about. And that's this reconciliation amendment is just one facet of the larger game that the representative, our congressional delegation, and the governor are trying to play, which is really trying to force the sale of these millions of acres of what are federal public lands.
You have sued over that part of it. Where does that lawsuit stand?
So we have, that's sitting in state district court. The state of Utah has moved to throw out the case. We've opposed it. We're waiting for the judge to hear it.
Okay, we shall watch that. Steve Bloch, the legal director with Southern Utah Wilderness Alliance, thank you for your time today and letting me push you on all of those issues. Well, coming up, Senator Mike Lee could pull porn off the internet. Why he says now is the time to act. Stay with us. Well, Utah's junior Senator John Curtis says both parties in Washington need to rethink their approach to entitlement reform. That came during his first ever address to the U.S. Senate this past week. Curtis says he intentionally waited that long to follow a chamber tradition of freshman senators watching and learning before they make their first remarks on the floor. In a wide-ranging speech, Curtis called for, quote, wildly honest conversations on Capitol Hill on big issues like lowering the deficit.
We, and I mean we, Democrats and Republicans in this body, are not being honest with the American people when we pretend that Social Security, Medicaid, and Medicare don't need reform. And we are equally dishonest when we weaponize fear, telling seniors and the most vulnerable that reform means abandonment. It doesn't. It never has.
Now, Curtis says his four main priorities in the Senate will be energy development, restoring local control of federal lands, curbing the influence of China, and lowering the national debt. Meanwhile, Utah's senior Senator Mike Lee has introduced a bill that could ban pornography. The Interstate Obscenity Definition Act would roll explicit depictions of nudity or sex acts that lack, quote, serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value into obscenity laws. Now, that could effectively make it illegal to distribute or consume pornography. Lee cites the widespread availability of internet porn as a serious threat to children that calls for a serious response. Well, this weekend, the Utah GOP elected new party leadership, but due to the pre-taping deadlines of our program, we can't report them here for you on this program. To see our full coverage, you can visit abc4.com/politics. Our team was there all day, live blogging with extensive coverage. Again, that's abc4.com/politics, where you can view that. Well, that does it for today's Inside Utah Politics. Don't forget, if you have any local or political stories you'd like to see, make sure to reach out. That same website I mentioned is where you can find us, abc4.com/politics. You can email InsideUtahPolitics@abc4.com. I'm also on social media, X, Blue Sky, and Threads. Lindsay on Air on Instagram as well. Just spell Lindsay with an A. Our show is also online in podcast form. You just search for Inside Utah Politics with Lindsay Aerts wherever you get your podcasts. Well, thanks for being with us, everyone. We will see you next week.